Hey everyone, this is the XRP Agent. I have an exciting show for you today. Jay Kim has interviewed 4 executives from Ripple. The CEO, Brad Garlinghouse, the CTO, David Schwartz, the SVP of Customer Success, Marcus Treacher, and SVP of Global Operations, Eric Van Miltenburg. Excuse me. So he condensed these conversations in this podcast. It's a little long, but it got a lot of good nuggets and information. So I hope you enjoy it. Let's dig in.
I was recently invited to attend Ripple's annual conference called Swell, which is held down in Singapore this year. Ripple is a US-based fintech company whose main goal is to enable banks and financial institutions to easily send money across the globe by leveraging blockchain technology. I was also given a rare opportunity to sit down and interview a number of the company's executives to discuss their vision for what they call the Internet of Value. We also talked about the company's main product offerings, their native digital asset called XRP, and the independent decentralized cryptographic ledger, which XRP runs on, called the XRP Ledger. For those of you who have already been involved in the blockchain or crypto space for a while, you will be quite familiar with the tribalism and polarity that exists in this space, particularly among the holders and supporters of the various cryptocurrencies. With that in mind, the format of this week's program will be slightly different than usual. I've taken the most salient discussion points from the various 4 interviews I've had and merged them into one longer deep dive episode with the goal of giving you the most unbiased, objective, and comprehensive overview of what Ripple does as a company and what their plans are for the future. Our exploration begins with a high-level discussion with Brad Garlinghouse, the CEO of Ripple. He gives us a solid background of the current banking system, an overview of Ripple's business model, and the big problem that Ripple is trying to solve. Brad is the CEO of Ripple and a member of the board of directors. Prior to Ripple, Brad held various senior executive positions at Hightail, AOL, and Yahoo. We're here with Brad Garlinghouse, CEO of Ripple. Thank you for welcoming me to the Swell Conference here in Singapore. How are you liking Singapore? How's your trip in and everything?
It's been phenomenal. Other than some sketchy weather today, Singapore has been a tremendous host for this. And part of the reason why we chose Singapore, frankly, is it is obviously a hub for a lot of activity across APAC. About 40% of our customers are in the Asia-Pacific region. And there's also a lot of regulatory clarity, or more regulatory clarity here than a lot of other markets. And that's obviously good for the blockchain industry at large.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So we're going to get into all of that. Let's go with I'm going to try to breeze through the 101s quickly, but let's get some background on you quickly for people out there that don't know who you are. Where you're from, what got you into tech, because I know you're a longtime tech person, and why you ended up joining Ripple, back when you did.
So I grew up in the United States in Kansas and went to the University of Kansas, and have always been gravitated toward technology. The extra level of detail there is my dad bought us a TRS-80 computer, which some of your listeners will know what that is, most won't. And so kind of got exposed to computing and programming at a very early age, and it stuck with me. And so spent part of my career on the infrastructure doing network stuff, telco, coax cable stuff, but ended up at Ripple in large part. I've always kind of gravitated towards leading edge and at times bleeding edge areas that I've thought could in some way change the world. Mm-hmm. I got involved with the internet very, very early. Got exposed to the Mosaic browser in 1993, and one thing led to another, and spent a lot of time on the internet side, and then a long career at Yahoo. But for me, what blockchain represents, what crypto represents, is a 10 or 20 year evolution where I think it's going to impact more and more industries and more ways in which global commerce operates. And I mean that in kind of every definition. And so I wanted to get involved with it, and I got involved with Ripple, and feel through a little bit of luck and a little bit of skill, we find ourselves in a really interesting spot.
Yeah, I mean that's a good intro. Kansas. The reason I know I'm a Carolina grad, so Roy Williams. Jayhawks.
We're friends. Then.
We're friendly. Yeah. Competitive.
We both hate Duke, so that's
absolutely
good.
Yeah. So that's a good common ground for us to start with. Okay, so let's hear the sort of one-liner elevator pitch, if you will. What is Ripple as a company, and what problem are you trying to solve?
Ripple as a company, effectively, in its kind of simplistic way, is an enterprise software company selling software to banks. The tech stack we use includes both an open source digital asset called XRP, as well as some on-ramps and off-ramps, which are kind of proprietary blockchain capabilities that allow for banks to do real-time settlement. So today, as many, I'm sure, listening here are familiar, cross-border financial transactions, whether it's remittances, corporate, they tend to be very slow and very expensive. We have kind of talked about since the beginning of Ripple the idea of an internet of value. How do we let value move the way information moves today? You based in Hong Kong and I, you can watch a North Carolina game from anywhere in the world anytime, yet you can't send a wire on Sunday. One of our panelists here at the Swell Conference yesterday made the comment that, we put a man on the moon, we found water on Mars, yet you can't send a wire on Sunday. It's pretty crazy that our global financial infrastructure is, 4 to 5 decades old in terms of how it operates, and all of the things that go with that, error rates, speed, costs, are 4 or 5 decades old. And we think it's time to bring that to a modern infrastructure. And there's a lot of downstream implications that we think are pretty exciting for lots of people.
It's pretty remarkable that, no one's actually looked that deep into, or maybe people have, but, no one's really come forth. I mean, you see a lot of payment solutions that people are coming up with from the technology world, but they're more for the consumer.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people just didn't know how archaic the infrastructure, the current plumbing is for institutional cross-border payments.
Well, if I might interject on that, I commented on this a little bit in my opening remarks to the Swell Conference yesterday, but a lot of the people doing interesting things, whether it's consumer or otherwise, in payments, they're kind of hacks on the existing infrastructure where, because of the limitations of the system, they're building workarounds that allow for a better experience, but they're not actually changing the infrastructure. And so Ripple, from its earliest days, had this audacious goal of, if you really want to enable the internet of value, you have to rework the plumbing. And that's where Ripple has been, focused. If we can reset the plumbing, and as I'm sure we'll talk about, we now have a lot of customers and a lot of momentum towards that.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. And were the founders of Ripple sort of from the payment side? Were they from a bank, a financial institution? Like, how would they even look to overturn that stone and be like, okay, this needs disruption, right?
It's a good question. It's Chris Larson, who is the chairman of the company and was one of the co-founders. He founded eLoan, which is one of the first lending platforms on the internet back in the early days of kind of Internet 1.0. And then more recently, he founded a peer-to-peer lending site called Prosper. And so he firsthand had seen some of the limitations, and for really a decade or two, been thinking about how does fintech enable a broader community to be part of the banked community, the first world financial system. And for him, the Ripple vision really, came from some of those experiences. I don't come from payments, and actually kind of a funny story on this is when I first got the call asking, it was a recruiter calling me, he said, well, Ripple's looking for somebody. And I said, like, I'm not your guy. I know some people at PayPal. I know some people at Visa. Like, you should talk to them. And what the recruiter said is, well, Chris Larson feels like in order to find somebody to really change a system, you want somebody from kind of outside the system to look at it differently. I don't know if he's right or not, but here I am 5 years later.
There we go. Yeah. Well, we shall see. We shall see. Okay. So the basic Ripple, the company, the basic, revenue model, so to speak, selling enterprise software to financial institutions, banks, intermediaries. And within that, you have a couple of products. Your current product, which is sort of the easiest first step to get these guys on board, and then you have what used to be known as XRP on-demand liquidity. The artist formerly known as
yes,
XRP.
exactly, Prince.
And so maybe you can talk us through those two products, because I think that there's a little bit of confusion, especially from people that haven't researched Ripple, the company, that well. The initial pushback was basically, oh, well, you don't need to use the digital asset. You could just do everything on Xcurrent. So maybe...
Yeah, we'll talk through it. So the idea was kind of exactly as you introduced. We wanted to bring banks, financial institutions into the opportunities represented by these new technologies. And, frankly, starting at the deep end, and I'll say the deep end is going all the way into using digital assets to solve some of these problems as opposed to gradually working them into that. We have found it much more effective to start having a conversation about how they can use products like what we've called Xcurrent, which is kind of when someone wants to connect to RippleNet using fiat. So, you can connect from the Bank of Brad to another bank using dollars to peso, but that's using the existing pre-funded accounts. Now, if you have pre-funded accounts in your bank, this is a more efficient messaging system than what is Swift is typically what people would use. And it's a more efficient version. That's good. What we have found is by getting them on board, it gives us an opportunity to explain to them, look, there's an opportunity such that you don't have to pre-fund. And that's where on-demand liquidity comes into play. And the idea being that, when a financial institution, whether it's a bank or payment provider, is pre-funding, they're taking working capital. They're taking their balance sheet resources and they're parking them somewhere such that they then can have that nostro-vostro relationship between banks. It's how the correspondent banking system works.
Yeah, so literally Xcurrent is essentially a better version of Swift. I mean, you don't have to, I don't want to get you in trouble or anything, but I mean, essentially that's what it is. You're going into that infrastructure. You're basically saying, look, this is going to be just faster and better. And you don't have to necessarily build out anything further from, or you guys go in and...
Yeah, that's basically true. I mean, it is a simplistic version, but look, Swift today is a one-way messaging framework. I use the comparison, if you were to send me a postcard, you would fill out the postcard, Brad Garlinghouse, blah, 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 nice to see you, stick it in the post office, put it in a mailbox, and then you have no idea what happens, right? It goes in the mailbox, you have no idea what routing it went to. You don't even know if I got it. You don't know how long it took me to get it, none of those things. Swift kind of works the same way. You execute a Swift wire transaction. You don't know when. The only way you know I received it is when I send you a note saying, hey, I got your wire.
Right.
So what we have done is really taken that, I think, very rudimentary infrastructure that was built decades ago and said, look, let's have a two-way messaging framework. And when I'm typing in, I want to send a wire to Brad Garlinghouse, you can, in real time, verify does the account number match the name. One of the primary errors that happens through Swift is somebody, maybe fat fingers, instead of Brad Garlinghouse, they say Brad Garlington, and they put in the account number, and it goes to the other bank, and they're like, the account number doesn't match the username. The account number and the account name don't match, and so it's rejected. That causes lots of overhead, and that type of stuff just doesn't need to happen in a world where you can use better technologies, internet-based technologies, to do this in real time.
Yeah, so that's again, when you unpack this, it's kind of mind-blowing that this hasn't been improved yet.
Yeah,
or is in the process of still. Okay, and then so now once a customer is onboarded onto Xcurrent, on-demand liquidity is another solution. Does that come in the same enterprise software suite where they can simply
flip a switch?
Flip a switch,
yeah.
and you gotta be careful with that, by the way. That phrase.
Again, it's a little bit simplistic, but the idea being that when someone connects to RippleNet, they don't have to think about, okay, I want this product. You're connected to RippleNet, and we can offer different features and functionality within that. If you already have liquidity, you don't need to use on-demand liquidity. And those payments don't touch XRP. If you don't have liquidity and you want to shoot payments into the Philippines and you don't have a correspondent banking relationship there, we can help you solve that. And we can do that in real time. You don't have to pre-fund, and you can shoot off payments into Philippines using XRP as the payment mechanism.
Right. And so if you're a bank, if you didn't have a correspondent bank relationship, maybe you can talk a little bit about correspondent banks and the massive amount of business that they're doing because some of these banks have to use them. They're basically forced to use them until now.
Yeah, you really didn't have an option, and this is the banking system. And I have pointed this out in various interviews over the years. There's $10 trillion pre-funded in accounts around the world, which is effectively the grease, the oil that is facilitating the engine that is correspondent banking. The oil has to be there, or correspondent banking won't work. And so it's the oil that sits there. Now, if we could reduce the amount of oil, that improves the efficiency of the global economy.
Sure.
So we feel like bit by bit, we're going to be able to take that $10 trillion down to $9 trillion, down to $8 trillion. And this is a journey that will take, many years. But we're, as I'm sure we'll get into, incredibly enthused by the progress we've made in a relatively short amount of time.
So, so from a customer perspective, then they're able to, so there's a significant cost savings as well when they switch over to on-demand liquidity. So it's more of sort of getting them on to Xcurrent, indoctrinating them into how it all works, and then basically it's for them to decide on their own.
Yeah, well, it's a cross-sell. I mean, they decide on their own. We're evangelizing. If you're working with a bank or a payment provider and you're saying, hey, here's what we can do in this corridor, and that might be fiat to fiat, but hey, you want to open up a new corridor. You have customers in Brazil that you can't serve. I mean, one anecdote I would offer, we were talking to one of the largest banks in Canada, and they were exiting their correspondent banking relationship in Brazil. Now, they still have customers that want to do business in Brazil, but they just decided the cost and the overhead of maintaining that relationship of a correspondent bank, maintaining that Nostro Vostra account relationship, they decided that there's too much overhead associated with that. So they closed that relationship, but they still need to enable payments into Brazil. So they just used a different correspondent. That means they're paying somebody else, but they still have customers who want to enable payments into Brazil. Our viewpoint is in the future, I think they told us this about a year ago, but what they basically said is, look, if you can enable us to be in Brazil without being in Brazil, that's fabulous. Now, when they were telling us this story, we weren't ready. We first announced the product of on-demand liquidity at the time, as you described earlier, called XRapid.
Right.
We first announced our intent to productize that a year ago at the Swell Conference, and we went live in January. And again, we've got now over 22 dozen customers that are live using on-demand liquidity, which is huge progress.
Yeah, I saw that press release yesterday, which was awesome. So congratulations.
Thank you.
It's from the sort of solution that you're selling to enterprise customers. So I guess it's an annual fee. Is there someone that comes and helps implement this technology inside the institution? And then that leads to this question of, look, anything using a digital asset at this stage or crypto is a bit clunky to get on board. Like if I want to go and trade Bitcoin today, I have to fiat, put it into some sort of exchange that accepts it, trade it, there's a fee, there's a spread, and then I have to, and then here comes the question of volatility and this sort of thing. Do you guys have that's part of your tech stack that I guess you put in? So
we want to make it as simple as possible. So, we've been very public about the work we're doing with MoneyGram. I'll be on stage later this morning with the CEO of MoneyGram talking about the work they're doing. And so we want MoneyGram to see a dollar peso quote.
Right.
What happens in the kind of plumbing of that transaction? At the end of the day, they just want to know that, hey, that's the quote. I need liquidity in Mexico, and if I can get it at that price, great, done, click. What ends up happening is there's a trade from dollar into XRP. XRP then moves to an exchange in Mexico. Then there's a trade from XRP. You're selling the XRP and buying Mexican pesos. Right. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. Frankly, we want to make that as simple as possible to the customer. All the customer really cares about is, I need a dollar peso quote.
Right.
I need $1,000 moved into Mexican pesos, and I need to do it right now.
Yeah. So whoever's trading on their internal treasury desk or whatever, you want to make that customer experience as seamless and
right.
Yeah.
Because anything that causes confusion limits success. And you asked earlier about how some of these contracts work. I mean, you're right. When we go live with a bank, it isn't just, hey, it's like a Salesforce seat where you're just lighting up an instance in the cloud. You actually are deploying technology typically today behind a firewall, right? You're going and, we have integration engineers who fly around the world and, go on site with a bank, with a payment provider and help with that deployment. And that's the nature of how this stuff works. And it's, part of our business model.
So when it comes to, let's talk a little bit about volatility, because I know that this is a big issue and a lot of people misunderstand this part of it, the volatility of holding a fiat currency or other cryptocurrencies versus using XRP for a transaction, which is very fast. And by virtue of the short amount of time that is actually takes to make a transaction, it should, in theory, be less volatile. But is there a black swan of, there could be a situation where there's a flash crash during those 3 seconds that it takes. That could, that's a real risk, isn't it?
Let's talk about volatility at large first, and we'll talk about is that a risk? At the most macro level, when you transact a low volatile asset like fiat, but it takes 2 to 3 days to transact, somebody's taking that volatility risk for that 2 to 3 days. Now, what happens today is somebody is pricing that volatility. When you do a fiat transaction, somebody is selling you that volatility risk, and it's embedded in the price. Now, today, oftentimes that's the bank you're working with. Sometimes they use somebody else. There's an FX desk. Depends on which bank you're talking about, who provides that insurance, if you will. Now, some people are like, look, we can't use crypto to enable these transactions because there's too much volatility. Volatility, though, is duration, is time, times volatility. And it turns out if you take a low volatile asset over a very lengthy time, which is about 3 days, is about 260,000 seconds, or you have a high volatile asset like XRP over a very, very, very short amount of time, it turns out there's less volatility risk in an XRP transaction than there is in fiat. Now, as you're describing, though, somebody's selling you the risk mitigation in fiat because you don't even really think about it that way. Right. You're like, look, I priced it at that moment, but embedded in that price was somebody taking the settlement risk.
That's right.
Now, today, because it's so fast, you don't have that in the crypto space. XRP, maybe you would need that in the Bitcoin space because a transaction is quite slow, relatively speaking.
Yes.
An XRP transaction, is 3 to 4 seconds. And so is there a risk? We haven't yet seen the risk of a, quote, flash crash, as you're describing. I'm not trying to pretend that's a zero risk. Mm-hmm. I think if it's a material risk, someone will come in and sell a product to risk mitigate that. There's
default
market makers
swap or whatever. Yeah. Right.
Somebody will build a product and it'll solve that problem. Right. And if there's enough demand for it, they'll do it. Today, I'm not sure that'll ever be needed. I don't know. But right now it's, because it's so fast, we haven't seen it be a problem.
Sure.
And we're doing, many millions of dollars a week over on-demand liquidity. And so this isn't, we're way past an experimentation phase, right? This is actually real. It is working. It's at scale.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so last sort of question, and thanks for taking us through sort of the plumbing and technical side of your product offering. Ripple, the company, is one of the crypto unicorns out there, and it's a strange one because you've taken venture funding, and then you also have this digital asset, which I don't know how the accounting works, but that's worth a lot of money. A lot of people have, not a lot of people, a lot of projects I've seen have come and done these ICOs, and they don't even have a main net, or I can think of a couple off the top of my head. So you guys are in a unique situation where you might not necessarily need the funding, or you're well capitalized at this point, I would say. How does that play out in the future as far as Ripple, the company? You have your venture investors that obviously want a return, and then do you plan to basically just grow the company separately, not separately, but like in the traditional venture funding path to some sort of exit, and then how does the digital asset play into the whole thing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm glad that when you asked the question, you have an understanding that some in the market still have confusion about what is Ripple and what is XRP. And I think one of the most important things to understand is XRP is an open source technology, the XRP ledger, the digital asset itself. There's lots of participants in the XRP ecosystem. Ripple is certainly the largest amongst them, but there's a lot of other people doing things in the XRP ecosystem, and we think that's good for the whole category. Ripple has shareholders. As you mentioned, we did a seed financing back in 2012. It's before I was at the company. We did a Series A in 2013, 2014, and a Series B in 2015. And we haven't raised any money since, I guess that was 2016, the Series B was, but we haven't done any financing since that time. And we, as you described, we're in a good position in that we are now a lot of customers signing up by virtue of owning some of this digital asset that has given us a strength in the balance sheet. We put $50 million into MoneyGram as an example, and we made a bunch of investments across the crypto landscape, which we think is good for all of crypto.
Sure.
We want all boats to rise. I think there still remains a lot of tribalism or religiousness within crypto, which I don't think is actually healthy for the whole system to grow. I fundamentally believe that Ripple will do better if the whole category does better. And so, frankly, I'm rooting for everybody to do well. I can't think of anybody in the crypto space that is, quote, competing with Ripple. And so I look at it and say, I want a lot of these projects to work. I think a lot of them are still in the experimentation phase, but I think it's good for Ripple and it's good for XRP. It's good for Bitcoin. It's good for Ether if everybody's doing well.
To play devil's advocate, could XRP have actually just been a private corporate digital asset that you didn't actually offer to the public? I mean, that in theory, if it was just that problem that you were trying to solve, then in theory that could have been just a...
Well, sort of. First of all, one clarification: Ripple didn't quote offer XRP to the public. Meaning, XRP, the ledger XRP existed before Ripple, the company, was started. Some of the people who started XRP ledger started Ripple, so there's some common heritage. But the tricky part in what you describe is, could it work without some external market participation? Is effectively, I think, what you're asking. So let's think through that. So we've announced we are going live at so we're live today at the Mexican peso through ODL. We're live with the Philippine peso, and we are now live with the Australian dollar. We've announced the intent to go live with the Brazilian real. Now, if we go live and there's no liquidity, there's no clearing price between XRP and the Brazilian real, that's a problem.
Right. Okay.
So the fact that there's liquidity there organically, if you will, because about 45 billion units of XRP trade out there. They're not owned by Ripple. They're owned by other people, and they're trading. Now, when we enter a market, there's liquidity. There's some liquidity there. We often will work with market makers to help make sure there's plenty of liquidity and the spreads are tight. But if there was zero liquidity, that would actually make it hard to enter a new market.
Towards the second half of our discussion, Brad and I discussed Ripple, the company, and XRP, the digital asset, and the important distinction between the two. XRP and the XRP ledger are open source technologies, and while Ripple may be one of the largest participants in that ecosystem, there are many other participants in the XRP ecosystem which will still exist whether or not Ripple, the company, succeeds. To gain a better understanding of the early days of the XRP ledger and the technology behind it, we jump to my discussion with David Schwartz, Chief Technology Officer at Ripple. David is one of the original architects of the Ripple Consensus Network. He begins by sharing some of his background, including his work developing encrypted cloud storage and enterprise messaging systems for organizations such as CNN and the NSA. Then we jump into a more technical discussion about Ripple's Consensus Network. To be honest, a lot of our discussion was way over my head at the time. But as always, David did an incredible job of explaining the technical details to me, a layman, in a non-technical fashion.
Well, I was working for software companies and internet service providers, building nationwide networks and then doing secure messaging and cloud storage. And I kind of focused more on the crypto side because I have a strong math background. And I found Bitcoin in 2011, and I kind of fell in love with it. It had a sort of technical perfection where all of the pieces just kind of come together in a way that just I found really appealing. So I started to dig into what was going on with Bitcoin, and very quickly Jed McCaleb was starting a project to see if you could have a public blockchain without proof of work. He was starting to anticipate some of the problems that would happen with proof of work, that it wouldn't deliver on the promise of decentralization. And so at first, that was the only idea we had. Like, do you have to have proof of work to have a blockchain? And the XRP ledger was the first blockchain that used something other than proof of work. And then we kind of built a company to try to figure out how to get enterprise adoption. How can you match the cryptocurrency world with the sort of financial world? And I think there were a lot of people who were focusing on a sort of bottom-up strategy that, like, you would go directly to mass retail adoption, and then that would be the way to change the world. I don't think that works very well. I think that you almost have to try a top-down approach. People will look at examples like the internet. The first adopters of the internet were the government. They were universities, and they were existing information service providers that found that the internet was a better solution. So I think we kind of pursued that kind of, what will it take to get enterprise adoption? What kind of infrastructure do we need to get the technology mature enough that you can have mass adoption? And I've been working on that, since 2011.
So by dating it, timestamp at 2011, so you immediately answer the question of if you're Satoshi Nakamoto, because I know that's floating out there. So we'll go ahead and say perhaps you're not.
No.
As far as how you, decided to tackle this solution, the solution to the payments problem, I guess, or digital payments problem. So it is true indeed that Bitcoin initially was meant to be a payment network, and now it's kind of, because of the slow lag time and potential sort of 51% attack that could happen. It seems like it is becoming more of like a digital gold versus solving the payments thing. So I think it's interesting that you guys had the foresight to kind of see that sort of mining thing, proof of work, might come into might be a problem in the future, and decide to start another venture, especially from the way that you guys did it from sort of enterprise adoption first. I think it's very clever and it's very smart. So was that the time where you decided to start working on the XRP ledger?
Yeah, it began as just this idea of could you do something other than proof of work? That was the very first idea. And Jed had the idea that we could use what it's called a distributed agreement protocol. And there were existing distributed agreement protocols. It's just they had certain restrictions on them that made them not suitable for a public blockchain. So the question that Jed first hired me to answer is, can we relax those restrictions without breaking the protocols? And it only took us a couple of months to realize that the answer to that was yes. But the next question that we had is like, what is that good for? Mm-hmm. If you discovered a way to make a new material, but it's really expensive and it's really heavy and it corrodes easily, you're like, oh crap, like we made this brilliant new material. It's this clever combination, but it isn't good for anything. So we started to have to figure out like, what is this good for? And we realized very quickly that it had certain advantages over proof of work, including just that it could be cheaper, that it could be faster, but some that are a little bit more sort of in the weeds technically, that there isn't a dictator who chooses what goes in each block. And so we started focusing on use cases that would take advantage of the benefits of the protocol that we had developed. And then over the next year or so, mostly Arthur Brito and I wrote the software for the XRP ledger, and the features that we built to take advantage of the characteristics of the distributed agreement protocol were things like a decentralized exchange and key rotation and other features that the XRP ledger still has to this day.
Right. So from in its core, the consensus protocol that Ripple, the XRP ledger runs off of, is completely different than, say, Bitcoin's proof of work. Maybe in layman's terms, you could explain to us the basic differences there, and then expand upon how the XRP ledger, like, why is it so fast, and how is it so efficient? How did you make it so fast, right?
Well, I kind of approached Bitcoin the way you might approach an alien artifact. Like you find an alien artifact and it does something incredible that you couldn't do. It uses very little energy, or it goes right faster. It has some characteristic, and what you want to do is you want to, like, from an engineering standpoint, you want to take it apart. And one of the first questions that you want to know is like, does it have something you've never seen before, like unobtainium? Is there some unobtainium in there that someone discovered? Or is it just a clever combination of existing parts? And of course, Bitcoin doesn't have any unobtainium. It's a clever combination of parts. And then you look at, well, what are the parts and how are they combined and what are the benefits you get out of it? And then it's like, well, can I combine those same parts differently or change some of the parts to get different benefits? And a lot of people at the time, and that would include me, thought that the proof of work was like the unobtainium. The proof of work was like the thing that Bitcoin had that nothing else had. And it's true that was sort of like the last piece. That was the piece that previous systems didn't have. But really its secret was a clever combination of existing pieces. And those key pieces that the XRP ledger also has is that all transactions are public, all state is public, and everybody knows the rules. So I don't have to trust anybody else. If someone says, hey, I have 2 Bitcoins, like I say, show me the transactions, let me check that they're valid. We kept all of that. And so the only thing that we're left with, the only problem that you had to solve was what we call the double spend problem, which is if someone submits 2 transactions that conflict, how do you make sure that everybody eventually agrees on the same transaction? And what we rapidly discovered is that that problem is actually much easier than it initially appears. For one thing, we don't care what dishonest people can tell themselves. Like I can modify my XRP ledger software, my Bitcoin software to say I have all the Bitcoins. If I can't get anybody else to believe me, that's fine. So what we care about is that it works for honest people and that malicious people can't lie to honest people. And it turns out that that breaks down very quickly. For example, if a transaction is invalid, there's no problem. No honest person will ever think it's valid. Invalid transactions present no problem at all.
Right.
And perfect transactions present no problem at all. If a transaction is absolutely perfect, every honest person will say yes to it. There's no problem. It turns out you actually only have one problem, which is what I would call a wobbler. It's a transaction that might seem valid in some contexts and might seem invalid. So an example of a wobbler would be I have 1 unit of value and I have 1 transaction to send it to Alice and 1 transaction to send it to Bob. And if you see the one to Alice, you might think the one to Bob is invalid. If you see the one to Bob, you might think the one to Alice is invalid. These are wobblers. They're not fundamentally broken, but they have a context in which they could be invalid. And all you need to do to solve wobblers is agree to sort of postpone one of them. So if we confront the 2 of them at the same time and we just agree to execute both of them, there's no problem. We'll execute them in the same order and we'll both agree on the first one's valid and the second one's invalid. The problem is if you execute just one and I execute just the other. And so all we have to do on that is just agree to sort of wait 1 round. You say, okay, we'll execute one and we'll just wait on the other. And what the XRP Ledger's consensus protocol does, it essentially agrees to defer transactions that some people think are valid and other people think are wobblers. And that's really the only, it sounds perverse that weird little technical thing is actually all that's left. That's really all proof of work is doing.
That's quite interesting. So the mechanism by which you're able to, I guess, batch them so you know which one's a wobbler or not is basically by the validator nodes on the network that they kind of go in some sort of order or there's a certain consensus or majority that needs to be voting in the right way, so to speak, right?
Right. So what will happen is each validator in a round will say, these are the transactions that I think are valid and should be executed this round. And then they actually go through a process of agreeing. Mm-hmm. And the agreement process is biased in favor of excluding transactions. And the reason you need to do that is because otherwise it might never terminate. Like if people could keep introducing new transactions sort of into the discussion, you might never finish and have agreement.
Right.
So what you do is you sort of work on a process of excluding transactions. Now you might think that a malicious actor might be able to keep excluding valid transactions, but here's the interesting part. The only reason an honest participant would exclude a valid transaction was because they didn't see it on time. Like if you saw a valid if it paid the right fee and there wasn't a conflicting transaction, everything was fine, the only reason you wouldn't vote to include it is because if you saw it too late. Well, if you saw it too late in the previous round, you certainly didn't see it too late in this round.
Right.
Like if you told me you didn't see it in the previous round on time, and the previous round came before this round, you necessarily saw it before this round. So no honest participant can say a valid transaction shouldn't be included 2 rounds in a row.
So what happens to that participant then if he's not honest?
So the honest participants identify the dishonest participants by them violating these rules, and they simply stop listening to them. So the thesis is the honest participants will stick around, and the dishonest participants, as soon as they do something bad, they will get excluded.
I see. So and a honest or dishonest participant, that is basically a validator node.
Right.
Each one of those represents a validator node. Okay, so and then there's the other question that I know has been out there asked many times is the sort of centralization of the validator nodes. How many does Ripple, the company, own? And does that pose an issue out there? You know, I'm curious, what is it, like, does it cost money to set up one of these nodes? Like, how does that work? And, you know, how many nodes are there out there right now? And, you know.
So I would start out by saying that the validators don't really control the network. They're really just agreeing to advance the ledger. They can't, there's nothing a validator node can really do other than like stall the network. Like if a validator node refuses to come to an agreement, then it could break the network, but then it has to sign all of its messages. So it's kind of like the same thing with Bitcoin. Like mining either works or it doesn't. And if mining works, like you don't really, you shouldn't really care about it. It's not really something that affects your ability to interact with the ledger. That said, the cost to run a mining node can be from very cheap. It depends on how you want to do it. If you just want to run a validator and you want to do the minimum necessary, there's someone who sent me a picture of a validator running on like a $300 computer in their living room next to their TV. And that works just fine. We would kind of prefer to see validators that were more maintained and higher quality because you don't need a lot of them. Quality is definitely more important than quantity here. If you could have 32 validators run by 32 completely different entities that were very reliable, that'd be great. And if any one of them like becomes unreliable, then you would just, we would hope people would stop listening to that validator and listen to some other validator. We're trying to get down to the point where Ripple is running just one validator, and we have at least like 32 of them out there. And that's fine. You don't need our permission to run a validator. You can just download the software, fire it up, and literally you enter one command and you're a validator. You're just like, I want to be a validator. You're a validator. That doesn't mean that anybody's listening to you. But you can then sort of convince people that you're operating reliably and that they should try to come to agreement with you to advance the ledger.
Right. And so going back to your previous argument, it's essentially almost like game theory, as the market will decide in the long run whether if you're honest or you're dishonest. If you're dishonest, then eventually you would hope that the rest of the people on the network, the ledger, would ignore basically what you're...
You have two choices. You can pretend to be honest, and the longer you do that, that's fine. At some point, presumably, like if you pretend to be honest forever, well, that's great, that's fine. It doesn't matter. At some point, and really about the only thing that you can do is you can try to censor or you can stop advancing the ledger. But in order to do that, you have to sign the statements that you're doing. The reason people are listening to you is because they're coming from your validator. And we would hope that if other people using the network want the network to work, and if they don't, why are they using the network? Right. They would then see who was provably being malicious and just stop listening to them. It is a different philosophy. It is a different design. Most of the other systems are using incentives. My argument is that incentives force a race to the bottom. Like, I'll give you an example. If you're a Bitcoin miner, you want to make money mining. If it costs you more money to run a miner than somebody else, you're just going to go out of business. You're going to lose money. And so it forces a race to the bottom. And so miners are like running in the most weird corners of the world with unreliable power and cheap hardware. And if it breaks, that's fine. They stop making some money, and they're okay with that because they're making money while they're operating. But their incentives are not aligned. Everybody who mines increases the mining difficulty for everybody else. So it becomes this sort of race to the bottom with misaligned incentives. If the only incentive to run a validator is that you want the network to be more reliable, all of the incentives are aligned. And as long as the cost is low, and as long as there's some set of people who find the network useful, if there aren't 32 people who find the network useful enough to run one computer, then it probably should die. It probably doesn't deserve to keep running. Again, it's worked for a couple of years. It is a somewhat newer technology, and I think we got it right, and time will tell.
Are the people that are, say, of the 32 that are running enterprise-grade validator nodes, are they customers of yours or partners or just friendly XRP entities out there?
All of the above. There's a lot of them that are universities, and some of them are doing it for research purposes, and some of them are doing it just because they want to improve the health of the ecosystem. Some of them are businesses or investors that have positions in XRP. Some of them are just XRP community members. Some of them are Ripple partners. Yeah, it varies. And I think variation is what you want. What you don't want, like the nightmare scenario, the worst case scenario is that the validators sort of collude against a particular party. And so if the more diverse they are, the less likely they are. My friend Arthur Brito, one of the other developers, he would say, like, I don't trust Hamas and I don't trust the CIA and I don't trust like the government of Israel, but they're not going to collude against me. Right. I mean, it's kind of silly. It's an unusual type of trust. You're not trusting them to act in your interest, or you're not trusting them not to do specific things like in general. You're trusting them not to align against you.
Right.
And And the hope is if the stakeholders of XRP, the people who are using the ledger, don't want it to be fair and they don't want it to be censorship resistant, then it won't be. There's no power that can force a system to be fair and wonderful if the people using it don't want it to be. What you want is a system that enables censorship resistant if that's what its users want. And if validators were to somehow like start colluding to censor transactions or colluding to stop the network, we would hope that the users would stop listening to those validators because they find the network less useful if it behaves that way. But an interesting thing about public blockchains is and the lack of counterparties and the lack of centralization is like, if I were the centralized operator of Bitcoin or the XRP ledger, I could promise you things that you might want. Like I could promise you that there won't be censorship. I could promise you that there'll never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. I could promise you things. But since there is no centralized operator, there's nobody who can promise you those things. So it's nice that there's nobody who can betray the promises, but it's kind of not nice that there's nobody who can make the promises. These systems will do what their stakeholders want them to do.
Right.
As we saw in the Bitcoin fork, people disagreed over what the block size should be. And so nobody could say, no, the block size shall be X and that's what it's going to be. Though they kind of had to fight it out. And so that's kind of the downside of decentralized systems.
So it sounds like, so from your perspective, what's the greatest risk to the XRP ledger right now? Is it a handful of validators, bad actors that are in there that all decide to collude for no incentive for whatever reason they want to, and basically disrupt the consensus protocol?
I don't think so, because I think even if they did that, it would kind of be a short-term speed bump. The things that I worry the most about is like a defect in the software that nobody's found yet, because who knows like what that could what damage that could cause in the short term. Almost anything you can sort of repair. If you have a historical snapshot, you can rewind, but obviously it really undermines like the value proposition is that these transactions are irreversible. Let's say I found some bug or exploit that let me do something on the XRP ledger I'm not supposed to be able to do. Like I found a way to create a whole bunch of XRP. We could agree to like rewind the ledger, but then anybody who accepted that XRP as payment for something, they would lose out. One of the biggest things that I think we did in the XRP ledger software that I'm very proud of is we built what we call an invariant checker, which is a specific security module to detect any transaction that violates a key rule. Prior to that, if you said to me, like, I'm worried that someone's going to find some way to create new XRP and like break the system, and I would have to say to you, and this is a terrible answer, look at the code and you'll see there's no place that anyone can create new XRP. Look at these thousands and thousands of lines of code. And if you find a way to create XRP, tell me and we'll get it fixed. But like, I don't think there is one. Do you think there is? Like, that's a terrible answer.
Right.
What you want to be able to do is point to a line of code that says this line of code says nobody should ever be able to create XRP. And Nick Bogalis and I developed a system called the invariant checker. And what it does is it executes transactions in what we call a sandbox. It executes the transaction without actually making any permanent changes to the ledger. And then there's the invariant checker looks at the sandbox and says, did this transaction create XRP? Did this transaction do anything that's not supposed to happen? And if it did, if there's a bug that allowed a transaction to do something terrible, it throws the sandbox away and puts an entry in the ledger that said, this transaction broke a system rule.
Right. Fortunately,
that's never happened. But those kinds of scenarios that we put all this effort into preventing them from happening, but there's no way that I can promise you that there's no bug.
Right.
So that's really what I think is the biggest threat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and then there's also the trust issue. Even if something like this came up and you were able to resolve it, then there's the community trust issue, which I mean, for whatever reason, the community is quite polarized in how they view the various projects, unfortunately. I mean,
yeah. Well, the Concorde had no accidents, and it was like the safest airplane. And then it had 2 accidents in a short span of time, and it went from being the very safest to one of the least safe. When you have such a good record, if you look at the XRP ledger's uptime, and you look at there's never been a reverse transaction, there's never been censorship, there's never been a rewind. It's like, well, can I promise you that that's good evidence to suggest that there might not be? But of course, in one incident, you would go from 100% to a number that it's got a bunch of 9s in it, but still, you really want that enterprise level of reliability. And that makes development very slow. Anytime you want to add a new feature, you take risk. And, a terrible answer to people is like, you've been relying on this blockchain for billions of dollars in value and it hasn't done anything terrible. I've made some changes to it. Rely on that for billions of dollars and we'll see if it does anything terrible. Like and that really, to some extent, obviously we're as careful as we can be, but really, you know, with other pieces of software, you might tell people, okay, some people try the new version, some stay on the old version. It's hard to do that in a blockchain because everybody has to agree on everything. And so we put out new versions and we have test networks, but people will never use the test network the way they'll use the real network. And it's a little scary. It makes development slow. The pace of development was super fast when we had 0 customers and nobody was using the XRP ledger. Yeah. And the day that we opened it up to the world is the day that development just became, you know, maybe 1/10 the speed.
Wow. Okay, interesting. And then just to make it clear, the XRP ledger it's its own entity. Ripple is a company that sells enterprise software solutions to financial institutions and banks that happen to use the XRP ledger and XRP, the digital asset, in their enterprise technology package platform.
That's exactly right. The XRP ledger is open to anyone. Anyone can use it. It's a public blockchain. You don't have to ask Ripple's permission. And if Ripple says no, you can use it anyway. Ripple's a company. We're a traditional company. We have shareholders. We have a CEO. We have a CTO, which would be me. We have customers, and we can provide you technical support. You know, you can't call up the XRP ledger or Bitcoin. You know, those are public blockchains.
Yes, Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP. I feel kind of tick off the box of, okay, there's a certain use case. I don't know whether it's right. Maybe Bitcoin's digital gold. Ethereum might be the smart contract platform. XRP, this payments thing. Someone coming new into the system, you know, a lot of talents accruing from Wall Street and new grads now, they want to go into blockchain. They don't want to go anywhere else. Any sort of areas, segments, verticals that you feel needs disruption? And it might be stuff that you guys are already working on at Ripple, because I know that you guys are doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes as well. What piece of advice could you give someone coming into this space?
Well, I think where you're going to see it first is like the more adjacent the vertical is to the verticals that we have already, the more, the earlier and the better the target. So payments were terrible. We're making payments better. And like store of value, means of exchange were terrible. We're making those things better. So the logical next thing is like, what is something that's terrible because payments are terrible? What is something that's terrible because we don't have a good store of value? If we have a better store of value, and what I would give as examples of that are things like lending, things like trade finance, things like sort of like equity settlement, tokenization of assets. Like I want exposure. I live in New Zealand and I want exposure to Apple stock. Like how do I get it?
Right.
Like, or I live in Brazil, but I'd rather have exposure to the dollar than the Brazilian real. Like those kind of things that are adjacent, that are really close and adjacent to payments. And what I would also, and this is a little crazy, is like, if you want to have small companies that compete with things that big companies do, like Airbnb, for example, is a big company.
Right.
They have a large number of payment engineers that allow them to take money in and may pay money out around the world, and that's what enables them to be so big. But if I want to compete with them, like let's say I know the Portland, Oregon area super well, and I'm going to inspect every property, and I'm going to come up with an algorithm to help them price it right, and I'll adjust their pricing to take advantage of supply and demand. I'm going to be fantastic. I'm going to be the best, like the Airbnb of Portland, Oregon.
Right.
But if my first step is I have to hire 200 payment engineers, that business is never going to get off the ground. So the thing is like, who can provide me that type of infrastructure at a one-stop shop? And then what can I do once I have that, where I don't have to, if I want to be an Amazon or if I want to be an Uber, and I have to spend these millions and millions of dollars on getting my payments right or getting my ability to move money around the globe, my treasury functions, like if I can do all those things super efficiently, who's going to give me the one-stop service? And then what are the new businesses that are going to become possible because they don't have to spend all of that money building up that infrastructure? That's like where we're going to go next, I think.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, very interesting. David, thanks again for your time. Last two questions are kind of related, but it's basically, who's Joel's cat, and what is the best place to find you, follow you, and harass you on whatever social media platform you're on?
Well, I'll answer in the other order. The best social media platform to find me on is Twitter, @JoelKatz. That's where I'm the most active. You might say I'm addicted to Twitter. I kind of am. I kind of like that platform.
It's great for sentiment and for jumping into conversations you probably shouldn't be jumping into. It's a lot of fun.
It's just weird that like some random person can respond to the president, and hundreds of people, thousands of people who are looking at what the president said are seeing what some random person said.
Yeah.
And then some like other person who's a famous celebrity will respond to that random person responding to the celebrity. It's like, oh my God, like this huge celebrity just responded to this random guy from Arkansas or whatever. I mean, I kind of like that.
It's great.
So the Joel Katz thing came from when I was in high school. I had a friend who was setting up a bulletin board system, which is like a pre-internet like communication system. And he asked me if I wanted an account, and I said yes. And he asked me if I wanted to use my real name, and I said no. I didn't know what I was going to do. And it's actually kind of an amusing story. Ren and Stimpy was a show on MTV.
Sure.
And he was a fan of Ren and Stimpy, so he made up a name for me. Stimpy's name is Stimpson J. Cat. And so he said, you'll be Stimpson J. Katz. And I used that name for a while, but then I started to do more serious stuff, and I'm like, I need a less ridiculous name. So I took some inspiration from 3M, which was originally called Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, and they went through a rebrand over time to change their name to 3M. So I went from Stimpson J. Katz to Stimpson Joel Katz, because you got to have a middle name.
That's right.
And then I went from Stimpson Joel Katz to S. Joel Katz, because sometimes people have a weird first name. Well, and then I just dropped the S, and I was Joel Katz.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for explaining the story, and with that, we'll end. Really appreciate the time, and really excited about what you guys are building at Ripple, and we look forward to tracking your progress.
My pleasure. Great talking to you, Jay.
All right. Next up is an excerpt from my discussion with Marcus Treacher, who is the SVP of Customer Success at Ripple. Marcus has over 30 years of experience in transaction banking and payment technology, including 12 years in global leadership roles at HSBC. He served as a member of the global board of Swift from 2010 to 2016, and prior to that, he held leadership positions at Citigroup and Accenture. Marcus begins by sharing with us some more details about the 300 plus customers that are using Ripple right now, and gives us a closer look at the unique experience that Ripple provides to its customers globally. What do you spend most of your day working on? And it might be completely different every single day, but what would you say takes up the majority of your time as the SVP of Customer Success?
It's in the title. I spend all my time with customers. So I'm a very lucky guy. I can get to work with very small startup, wonderful innovation teams, the biggest banks in the world, digital banks, platform companies. They're all our customers. So I spend most of my time making sure we're giving our customers a service which enables them to add value for their own users around the world. And also spending time getting feedback so we can fine-tune our product and we can guide our roadmap. And also spending a lot of time with helping our customers adopt our technology, integrate it in new ways, and helping them develop really kind of world-beating applications on their mobile devices or in other services, which kind of bring the Ripple vision to life.
Got it. So it's literally from onboarding a customer, trying to figure out the solution that would work best for their organization, no matter how large or small it is, all the way through to working with them on a daily basis just to make sure that everything is the relationship is intact and everything works.
That's absolutely right. So Ripple can enable a bank or a payment company to completely revolutionize all of its services. If you look at the payment world, actually there are many, many, many different payment use cases that banks and payment companies offer today. So paying friends and family, funding, let's say, property you may have overseas, small companies receiving funding, paying workforce, paying suppliers. It goes on. So what usually happens is a customer will use Ripple initially for, let's say, one corridor, one country, maybe India to Thailand, for example, or Middle East into Sri Lanka. And then for that corridor, they'll use one service. It might be remittance payments for individuals. When that works, they then move on to open up more corridors. They may create more services, let's say for small companies, big companies. They may, many of them actually run workshops with us to kind of co-create new services that we could enable them to offer that aren't possible today. So most of my work is really about the journey. As you say, it's from the initial onboarding of a customer. So we help them, we design how they are going to implement and use Ripple, and our project teams deliver that work with our customers. And then our account management teams then work with our customers. We allocate key customers to specific account managers around the world. I really grow the use of Ripple with them and make sure that we're giving them strong, clear success, both in terms of their top line numbers, their P&L, their market share, as well as the efficiency which we can deliver for them or help them to deliver in their operation, because the Ripple network is far more effective and efficient for the banks than the legacy networks. And we also have our support teams globally for tech support. So it's a whole, if you like, the whole service we offer from the initial sale. It's because it's annuity. You know, the payment business is really about working steadily, thick and thin, building out use, building out volume. It's a long game we play with our customers.
Sure. Well, you certainly have your hands full. I think yesterday there was the press release that said there's 300 or over 300 institutions or customers that are onboarded now on the RippleNet. And that number is only going to go one direction, Marcus. Yes. So your job is basically only going to be more and more full.
It is, yes, it is. And each of those customers themselves contain many more customers, if you like. So, let's pick Santander. One of those 300 is Santander. Santander itself has many, many projects it's running on Ripple. It has many connections it's running on Ripple. There is a whole line of really interesting, really powerful projects we're running with Santander, one of many, many of our customers. So we're also doing a lot of work in kind of really simplifying and improving how we onboard customers. So enabling us to serve very large numbers of customers in a very efficient way as we grow. And that's a great challenge to have to be able to work with. When I joined Ripple, we had, I think, one office outside San Francisco. That was Sydney. We now have 10 offices, including London, as you know, Singapore here, Reykjavik as well, for example.
Wow.
So Sao Paulo, Dubai, Mumbai, New York. So we're growing, Tokyo, we're growing very quickly globally. And one of the key things that we are really focusing on is how we gear up to support a very large number of customers, because the volume is growing and the customer base is growing very quickly, and do that in a way that's very effective, but also delivers the value to them and the service to them as the volume of customers grows.
Absolutely. It's a huge undertaking. And I imagine that, so what, if you had to, just quick numbers here, if you had to break down the percentage of, let's say, the 300 customers that are onboarded onto your platform, how many would you say are sort of larger financial institutions versus startups? And then how many of those 300 actually is it just the sort of blanket starter package of Ripple that can easily be integrated into their systems, or how many demand a more bespoke solution?
Okay, so first off, a very broad categorization. About half of our customers are banks, and half are fintech payment providers,
okay.
50-50. If you dig a bit deeper, within the banks, about 25% are the really big houses. The Bank of Tokyo, Mitsubishi, right. the Santander, the Standard Chartered, the large institutions. The rest are digital banks, startup banks, really interesting innovator banks, which we love to work with as well, because they can integrate in very, very new ways with the Ripple technology. In the payment provider half of the customer base, again, about half are pretty major, large established payment providers. Massive volumes, well-established organizations looking to put much more efficiency into their payment networks. Right. And the other half really are, early stage startups, just companies getting moving, who we refer to as growers. They're organizations that we can help grow, and Ripple grows with them. So as a company, we have, I think, a wonderful range of customers, enabling us to really innovate, but also innovate at scale. That's really, really important. In terms of the type of use, the basic kind of starter use of Ripple is the remittance payment. That's a very easy thing to understand for banks and payment companies to get comfortable with.
Right.
And also, it's addressing a real pain point in the global payment world today. The underbanked to the unbanked in Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America, it really has value. So that's kind of a very important starter usage for Ripple. Customers then often move on to the commercial side, so moving into serving small companies, SMEs, mid-sized companies. And that's where you get into more kind of operational value-add services, maybe collecting more effectively, paying staff more effectively, where it's not so much the speed that's important, but the certainty and the comfort that your payment really has got to where it's going.
The trust, right.
The trust is important. The other point too is if you look at the other end of the equation, every payment sent by a Ripple customer ends up with a Ripple customer before it's dispersed. So many of our customers focus on being inbound, being receivers of payment, almost like the correspondent banking, the agency banking model that we're familiar with.
Sure.
And that's a powerful play because it means that banks that have strong clearing ability in a country or region, Siam Commercial Bank is a great example of a strong clearing bank in Thailand that is taking a lot of volume from Ripple from customers worldwide who are serving their own customers who are making payments into Thailand, and they make that very, very high speed into Thai prompt pay to pay friends, family, or companies in Thailand. And that's a very, very important role that many banks find very attractive, to be that inbound player and therefore to pick up that volume.
Right. Okay, well, thanks for introducing and explaining that a little bit further. And then, so as far as the technology goes, once the customer is onboarded, part of your job is to handhold them and potentially come up with bespoke solutions regarding their various needs. And then I guess it's a matter of basically presenting really the data and the numbers to them. And I was talking to Brad earlier about sort of the on-demand liquidity product, which is now being more and more onboarded. I think 24 was in the same press release you guys announced, which is great. And I think that is it just a matter of basically getting them familiar with the product and then seeing the potential cost savings for them to eventually, adopt that technology as well in-house?
Yes, it's. I guess the first thing is to get a bank or payment company comfortable that we're delivering value.
Right.
So often we get a corridor running, we demonstrate the value in nearly every case. Our customers are delighted, surprised, and really enthused about what we can achieve because most people are still thinking in old ways. So we have a very big impact when we go live into production. And that leads to more usage and more application of the software. I think it's also important just to kind of paint a very quick picture about what we mean by Ripple, what we're kind of bringing to the market. In effect, we have three kind of killer apps, three really critical elements of Ripple, which we think is collectively so impactful. One is we've created a governance structure. So Ripple's rules, it's the methods of moving money between our customers, that's governed by our customers in a governance body that we set up with them. So it means that Ripple is serving a genuine community of customers, banks and payment companies, which work together as a community, not just customers of Ripple, but their own community. That's really, really important. And that model enables customers to then find other customers easily. Matchmaking is more straightforward. Connecting up is much easier. Going kind of one level into the Ripple solution, the next really important piece is the interconnection. So if you're making a payment for somebody cross-border, you need to be able to move ownership of money from your account or wallet, maybe in my case in sterling, let's say to an account in Hong Kong dollars in a few seconds. And we do that by kind of synchronizing the ledgers of the banks, our customers, at either end, the sending bank and the receiving bank. And that kind of very, very fast connection between banks using what we call the interledger method, interledger protocol. That's what moves a payment in an instant, atomically. So banks globally are mostly using that immediate payment element of Ripple under the rules that they govern. And that means they can pay each other in microseconds, incredibly fast, in now up to 45 countries, and very soon, global coverage. We're well on the way to global coverage. And that in itself is an awesome game changer, absolutely awesome. However, there's a third play, which is actually arguably much more impactful. And that's to attack the liquidity problem. Right. So today, the numbers vary, but you can be comfortable quoting 10 trillion to maybe 20 trillion dollars locked up around the world, any one moment, all the time, for payments to come eventually into a country and disperse. It's a huge load and drag on the global economy. So by developing our on-demand liquidity solution, we can address that problem. So as well as enabling payments to move hyperfast, we can deliver the liquidity into the country, into the account that the payment is going to run over at point when required. So it means that our banks and payment company customers can in future hold their currency, hold their value in their home currency, which far, far less risk, and deliver those liquidity pools at point of need. It's got three layers. It's the governance, hyper-fast delivery of payment between you and me, individuals via banks, and also enabling our banks to manage their liquidity far, far more efficiently than they ever can today.
Right. So I think that third layer is where most people, unless you are in sort of the banking system or are familiar with that, don't really know how it works. But that is essentially, I mean, that's money. Let's say my bank, SCB, let's use that example. For me to make remittance or payments into Thailand, I would basically have to deposit a certain amount of money with SCB. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then that just sits there when it could be on my books. I mean, that's working capital or whatever, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So that's it's a game changer, basically.
It's massive. Yeah, it's massive. And the beauty of what we're doing at Ripple, we're not just building solutions looking for problems like many blockchain companies do actually. We've always been focused on taking friction out of cross-border payments. That's what we do. And because we have that mindset of we're going to fix a problem and we're going to deploy the best and most creative minds in the industry against that problem, that's how we've moved so far with the blockchain stack. And actually, the hyper-fast delivery of value over interledger, the on-demand liquidity that kind of complements that very powerfully, they both deploy elements of blockchain fine-tuned for those solutions. The use of XRP, the use of the consensus ledger, perfectly designed and fine-tuned for on-demand liquidity, the application of cryptography for interledger, the protocol that we created and we given to the World Wide Web for interledger, perfectly tuned for creating an internet for value. And we got there because we focused on the problem, and from day one, we've been working with banks and payment companies from day one. Right. And it's a real world. And most of the history of Ripple is a combination of, in my view, my humble view, fantastic innovative creativity and real hard graft, grinding out solutions, fixing problems, speaking to customers. We're doing here with the Swell Conference, getting feedback and ideas. That's how you do it.
Marcus, let's take the last few minutes here, and I just want to talk about Asia specifically. Obviously, the Swell Conference is here in Singapore, and that's there's definitely a statement there. And you guys have a lot of partnerships here within the region. Maybe you could highlight some of the key partnerships that you have here. Any plans that you have going forward with Asia and the region, and what excites you about Ripple's growth here?
Okay, I'll do it in reverse order. We're massively excited about Asia and how Asia is driving fintech. I mean, some of the innovations around wallet technology, open network technology is pretty awesome. And that's, the key reason why we're focusing so much on Asia and why we've recently opened up a permanent office in Singapore, and we continue to build in Asia, so basically based in India and Singapore, but building up from there into other countries around China, Japan, Korea, very, very important. We see Asia really leading the charge into kind of almost reforming the world's financial models in really powerful ways that bring more people into the banking world, enable people to benefit financial services all over Asia, and also as Asia kind of leads the innovation, other regions are following, so like Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and we're seeing this what used to be called the emerging markets. Arguably, most have emerged very, very well the past 10 years. Seeing them, I guess, because they have a fresh view of how finance could work versus being kind of locked into old thinking, leading the charge. Ripple went to market really agnostically, so we weren't over-focusing on any one region initially when we went out of the USA. Having done that on an almost like an egalitarian basis, Asia, Middle East, Latin America are by far more traction than the OECD world. And we think it's because of two reasons. One, they're far less served by the old banking networks.
Right.
So if it's painful for me to move money in Europe, it's infinitely more painful to do so in Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. And secondly, you have this, this wonderful demographic of, young, energized, can-do people driving change and thinking differently. And you put those two things together and you get something very special, which is a complete transformation in goods and services, how things work and how people interact with each other. So we think Asia is a fantastic place to be, and many of our most active and fast-moving customers are in Asia, which is your first question. I can call out SBI Remit in Japan, phenomenal partner of Ripple. Coin1 in South Korea is growing fantastically, tremendous partner of Ripple. Sime Commercial Bank, Standard Chartered Bank in a hometown, Singapore. Many of the Indian banks we work with, IndusInd, Kotak, Yes Bank, Axis Bank. Recently won HDFC in India, QNB in Qatar, Saudi British Bank in Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
We got NCB, Saudi Arabia, Al Rajhi Bank. So there's a very long list of I think really powerful players. BDO, major bank in the Philippines, which we're delighted to have gone live with recently with a payment flow from Al Ansari in United Arab Emirates. Rack Bank. It just goes on. Payments flows into Asia, and we're seeing these corridors build up really quickly. Back to my earlier point, the initial use cases have all been remittances, paying friends and family, inter-Asia from the Middle East and other parts of the world. Very quickly, that's moving to commercial flows. And actually, in key corridors like into Philippines and into Mexico, we are now moving in with the on-demand liquidity service to, again, make the payment super efficient. We've had some wonderful experience in MoneyGram, for example, where 10% of their funding payments into Mexico now go over Ripple, ODL, which is pretty awesome. So you can see how you build the network, you make sure the customers are really engaged, they're getting value, you're really adding commercial value. You then use that to incrementally develop with them better propositions and then start working on that liquidity problem as well. And that's how you really get the kind of holistic.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure sitting down with you and hearing about all the exciting things you're working on. Last question is very easy. Where can people find you, follow you, and harass you on social media if they have questions?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, and do look at my posts. And the great thing about working for a small company is that, you can really make a difference. All the top team are on social media. Ripple is often tweeting, and we're often on LinkedIn. So look out for us, and it's a great journey. And we would welcome all support and any questions.
Absolutely.
Thank
we
you.
will be monitoring your progress, and we wish you the best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
At this point in the conference, I was thoroughly impressed. Swell was unlike any other blockchain conference I'd ever attended. In fact, it was much more of a fintech and professional finance services forum than a crypto conference. Everything from the leadership, the guest speakers, down to the technology presented really impressed me. But perhaps most impressive of all was the corporate culture that I witnessed directly from every single Ripple employee I met. I wanted to take a deeper dive into this, and for my final interview, I sat down with Eric van Miltenburg, who is the SVP of Global Operations at Ripple. Prior to joining Ripple, Eric held senior positions with high-growth startups and Fortune 500 companies such as Adobe, Yahoo, Hightail, Red Swoosh, Work.com, and ExciteAtHome.com. We begin our discussion talking about Eric's day-to-day responsibilities as head of global operations, and then he gives us a little bit of insight as to how they maintain this great corporate culture. So Eric, why don't you talk to us a little bit about your role at Ripple, what you do on a day-to-day basis, what do you spend most of your time working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, as head of global operations, there's a handful of things that fall underneath that. One is what we call business operations. It's really the ensuring on a daily basis that the sort of communications and coordination across the various functions of the company, especially at the leadership level, are going smoothly. We're identifying where there might be problems or cracks and quickly addressing them. So I have a team that does everything from just making sure that our leadership meetings are focused on the right topics and hold quarterly business reviews and just kind of business hygiene and maintenance along the way, which is important, especially as you're scaling a company. And then in addition, we'll embrace and drive other, I kind of hate to use the term strategic projects, but things that are cross-functional in nature and need some senior level care and feeding to ensure we come up with real, clear, crisp, actionable recommendations as to how we might act differently as a company. So that's business operations. I have another group which has really been fantastically fun for me because it's new, and that's our corporate social responsibility, or our kind of Ripple for Good, or giving. We're a very mission-driven company, and that comes from Brad, our CEO, Chris Larson, our founder and chairman. And we have a handful of activities that we pursue. One that is near and dear to my heart, and actually here in Singapore, we took it to the next level, if you will, and that it's called the University Blockchain Research Initiative. And it's a program we launched across 34 schools, 14 countries, where we are providing support of those institutions as they pursue research in blockchain, digital assets, cryptocurrencies, really trying to increase visibility and understanding of what this technology can mean, but also preparing the workforce of tomorrow. So one of our partners here in Singapore is NUS, National University of Singapore. We've been working with them for about 9 months, but this week when I was in town, we actually launched their fintech lab, which we're really proud to be able to support. And this is going to be a kind of a hands-on environment for students to get really practical, more than academic, theoretical knowledge and experience working with industry. And they're a fantastic partner and a great institution. And we're thrilled to be able to have a chance to partner with them. So that's the second part. And we do more than just that, but there's a philanthropic angle to what I'm involved with. And then third, and probably where I spend most of my time, is around our global operations, truly. So we have offices in 8+ cities around the world. And in several of them, we actually are staffing them up significantly because we need to be close to our customers. We need to be responsive to their needs in a timely fashion. We need to understand the use cases in the market, the regulatory environment, and you can't do that if all you do is sit in San Francisco.
Sure.
So it's been a busy week. We opened up officially our brand new office here. We've had employees in Singapore for a couple of years, but we've grown to a point where we needed our own space. We were in a Justco, a WeWork type facility,
Right.
and that was getting a little cramped. So we have a beautiful new office. We've over doubled the size of the team here in Singapore in the past year. We're 20 some odd, and we will make continued investments in this market. But and so I recently hired a guy to run our Southeast Asia operations based out of here. I also have somebody in Mumbai who covers all of South Asia and the Middle East. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, somebody who's covering all of South America. We have a joint venture with a Japanese company, so a woman on my team manages our joint venture relationship. So a lot of what keeps me busy is ensuring that we think sort of holistically about how we run the global strategic offices and make sure there's proper alignment and coordination with the rest of the company around the world.
Right. So obviously you must travel a lot because and increasingly more as you open up offices around the world. I guess your direct touch point would be sort of the heads of each of these offices.
Yeah, exactly.
So congratulations on the opening the Singapore office. I think that was very timely during Swell.
We're excited. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I asked some of the other people that I was speaking to earlier about the significance of Asia in sort of the roadmap and the grand vision of Ripple. What can you say about sort of Asia, its significance, and obviously you guys are making an investment here now with the team office and your Japanese partner, as you mentioned before. What's your outlook for Asia?
Yeah, outlook's super sunny. You certainly caught the point that Asia is an incredibly strategic geography, a part of the world for Ripple. We're, as you've heard from my colleagues, we're building a global payments network. Every financial institution that joins RippleNet is another node on that network, and so our goal right now is to light up the network to create as many high quality endpoints and financial institutions that allow more transacting. Each node can transact with another node. So we listen to the market, we listen to our customer, and there's just a ton of demand coming from Asia Pac. Honestly, about half of our customers are located in Asia Pac, which is, which in and of itself says a lot about this. And kind of an obvious question is why? I mean, what is it that we're doing that seems to resonate? And I think it goes to the fact that our sweet spot is really addressing payments use cases where there's low value, high volume payments being done. Right. So, low dollar amount, but there's just a lot of transactions. And I'd like to say now, yesterday's infrastructure was well suited much more to like big bulky payments that were, every week you could send a payroll for a large corporation from point A to point B. And the old infrastructure did that pretty well. But today's economy, you're looking at far more. I mean, the growth of remittances around the world is increased dramatically. It's over $600 billion now. In India alone, there's $70 billion a year flowing into the country from a remittance use case. So to address that, you can't lean on the old infrastructure. And the fact that Ripple is bringing sort of the next generation cross-border payments technology into operations, we're basically the only enterprise blockchain company that really has an in-production revenue-generating product out there. And, as I said, the market tells us where to go. So as we build this network, our customers identify which corridors they are looking to send or receive money from. And we obviously listen to that, and that helps us to identify which markets are important. And again, Asia has been a consistent theme. We've leaned into that across Asia Pac, both in Mumbai, as I mentioned, here in Tokyo with our joint venture partner. So, and we don't see that slowing down. I think we continue to get a really, really warm reception. What we're doing is resonating. So we will continue to lean into that, and I see our investment really growing in this region.
You find that the customers that you're targeting, they're more or less receptive in Asia to sort of this use of digital assets to solve this cross-border payment problem?
It varies. It certainly, you look at certain jurisdictions, certain geographies where central banks have been at the forefront of providing that regulatory clarity. So we work with not only banks and payment providers as our customers, but within the ecosystem, we also have to engage with regulators. We want to make sure that they feel comfortable with what we're doing and that they really are clear about what we're not doing. And that clarity oftentimes is the leading indicator of where adoption is greatest. And it's not unique to Asia. I think MAS has been super progressive. The Monetary Authority of Singapore has always set the tone for the region, and many other countries' central banks take their lead from some of the really innovative, progressive thinking that's happening here. Because I think the role regulators play is not only important, it's challenging, and that they have to regulate and protect the greater populace, but they can't do that if they're simultaneously stifling innovation.
Yes.
Right? So you've got to find that balance. And I think what is true in this part of the world is that the more forward-thinking regulators have noticed that some of the legacy providers, banks, et cetera, they're shortchanging the population. Right. The quality of solution isn't meeting the need, so therefore they have to adjust the regulation to let some of the fintechs come in and some of these new solutions, still regulated, still compliant, still keeping the greater population safe, but yet allowing innovation and allowing these higher quality of services, especially for the needs of the region, to be delivered efficiently and quickly.
So yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting to see what, like just last week, China kind of did a 180, and they're kind of trying to be on the forefront of digital assets and sort of encouraging that growth. India is another interesting market. I'm not sure what the legal status is there, but there's certainly a lot of unbanked there that could use a product like Ripple. So I guess what you might have just answered that, but what's the biggest pushback that you get from regulators when you go around the world? Is it basically that what you just said, balancing the need to protect the consumer versus or the user versus stifling innovation? Would you say that that's like getting them over that educational sort of hurdle is the hardest thing or the biggest pushback that you get, or are there other issues that you're faced with?
Yeah, I think maybe at a macro level that's true. I think mostly what we see is misperceptions, and so a lot of what we're doing is simply trying to educate. What does Ripple do, and almost equally as important, what is Ripple not doing? Right? I think people still glom on to some of the early stories associated with Bitcoin and blockchain, where all this sort of non-savory stuff was happening on the dark web, and there's a long sort of hangover from that. And so at first, banks hear crypto and they think, sort of anti-government, anti-bank. We're trying to circumvent the system and avoid, compliance and avoid paying taxes and all these things, right? And so when Ripple comes in and shares what we do, we work with banks. We're sitting down and engaging with you, Mr. or Mrs. Regulator. We explain that what we're trying to do is not replace fiat currency, the local currency, wherever it may be, but we're trying to make the movement of fiat currency from one country to another country more efficient. We're not trying to, avoid compliance. All the institutions we work with go through the, know your customer and anti-money laundering checks. The level of sort of anxiety goes down quickly. Now, that doesn't mean it's one conversation and everybody gets it. But it's not necessarily pushback after there's a full understanding of what Ripple's all about. Now, you're right. Certain markets, India, for example, they have more of a holistic anti-crypto stance right now. Is that going to last forever? We don't think so, because we've already seen in other markets there's been an evolution. Thailand, for example, was rather anti-digital assets. They've done I wouldn't say an about face, but they've warmed up significantly over the past 18 months or so. So I think there's, to us, and we're in the middle of it, we think it's more of a matter of time as opposed to a if. It's when, not if. Yeah. And so we invest a fair amount of energy. We've engaged with 50 central banks around the world, and we continue to want to make sure they're clear on what we do.
So along the same vein, let's talk a little bit about the company culture there at Ripple. From the people that I've met, and this is a credit to your company and to you as the head of global operations. Everyone that I've met has been very of the same culture, just very modest, down to earth, no arrogance whatsoever. For a company of your size operating at the scale that you guys are, it's very impressive to see that. Surely there are concerted metrics that are in place that in this sort of culture that you try to proliferate within the company walls. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you manage to create this type of culture.
Yeah, no, thank you for noticing that, because we are really proud of it. It is conscious, it is very proactive and purposeful. And it does start with our most senior leaders. Again, both Brad and Chris, our chairman, take building the right culture very seriously. Philosophy of, to create great products and user experiences, you got to have good people. But to have good people, you have to make sure that they're operating within the right culture. So we have a set of sort of values that we make explicit. On your first day, you're introduced to Ripple's values. We celebrate those on a quarterly basis. We have a quarterly all hands meeting where we reward a member of the team who has exemplified those values, and we celebrate them, and that reinforces that need, not that need, but that objective. One of the things we do is we also, on a very frequent basis, we survey the employees. We do employee engagement surveys, and as a leadership team, we spend a lot of time on the results. And there's always room for improvement, but we take very proactive steps, and with very specific owners if there's things that need improving, or we've seen great areas of opportunity. We can double down and know that some of our efforts are going well. So you're right. I've been at Ripple for 3 years. When I started, we were about 120 people. We just crossed 400 people around the world. So it's a fair amount of growth in 3 years, but it's growth for a company of our size. I think that's very distributed. We have the team, as I mentioned here in Singapore, is over 20 now. We have 40 some odd people in London, 30 in New York, 20 some odd in Mumbai. So we're a pretty distributed workforce for a company of our size. And so we know that we have to keep a real eye on the culture as we grow, not only just in size, but also in sort of geographic dispersity, to maintain that. And I think we've done a pretty good job so far, but it's a never-ending process, right? We always have to be conscious of it and investing in it, and it's something we do take seriously.
Well, I feel like it's going to be increasingly challenging as your company grows and sees more success around the world, and we'd hate for Yeah, I mean, we've all heard the stories, but I think the key, like you said in the beginning, it comes top down as well. So when the leadership exemplifies this type of culture and doesn't tolerate anything other than that, usually it tends to trickle down pretty well. So so kudos to you and your team there. Let's talk a little bit about sort of looking forward from an operations standpoint. Asia, obviously, we talked a little bit about any particular markets within Asia that you're particularly excited about, or even the rest of the world that you're looking to potentially add team members to, service a lot of new customers, or are going sort of leaning in heavily, talking or dealing with central banks.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of markets we're interested in. Again, we have our ear to the ground, so to speak. We're always, engaging with our existing customers and understanding the market dynamics. In Asia specifically, we've seen some great success in Thailand, and we'll continue to focus on our opportunities there. Philippines is especially exciting. One of the largest remittance markets in the world. Mm-hmm. We launched one of our key initiatives there. We call it liquidity on demand. This is where we actually are able to leverage a digital asset to facilitate very quick movement of value to the recipient using digital assets in the blockchain. That means they don't have to pre-fund accounts. I won't get into the detail, but it's a game changer in the industry. And Philippines is one of these countries where there's been the regulatory clarity, where we've launched the product, and as a result, we're seeing some great response there. So I think Philippines will continue to be a market of interest. With our JV partner in Japan, both Japan and Korea have also been real bright spots. So that's just kind of some top of mind countries, but there's plenty of opportunity across the whole spectrum. For us globally, in South America, Brazil has just been a fantastic market for us. I think there's some specific aspects of how money is allowed to move in and out of Brazil that our solution happens to address very effectively. So we're seeing some good traction there. We have been very methodical about how we roll things out. Again, we're still, in the broad spectrum of global payments companies, we're still relatively small. And so we want to make sure that we focus on a specific set of things and get them right, as opposed to try to spread ourselves too thin. So as we get success in a market, we sort of land and expand, if you will, throughout the region. One market that's very promising, we haven't, and this is by design, we haven't leaned in as much there is Africa. There's a lot of opportunity, and it isn't for lack of interest. It's more we want to get our first set of markets done right. So I wouldn't be surprised as you look into the next year and the year beyond that we do more in Africa to address that market.
Eric, thank you so much for your time. Last question is basically, where can people find you, follow you, if you're on social media, or learn more about the good work that you're doing there at Ripple?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Eric Van Am on Twitter, and you can definitely follow me there. I don't know how exciting what I have to say is, but it's worth checking in every now and then. But I appreciate you having me, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. Wish you guys the best of luck.
Thanks so much.
I wanted to wrap up this program by jumping back to the end of my first interview with Brad Garlinghouse, who previously mentioned that 40% of Ripple's customer base sits in Asia. Brad leaves us with some forward-looking statements with regards to the region in particular, his overall macro outlook on the crypto industry, and some sound advice for aspiring entrepreneurs looking to get into the space. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the conversations I had with the executives at Ripple as much as I did. This project is certainly one that I'll be keeping on my radar for the future. Let's talk a little bit about Swell and Asia specifically, because you're here. This is your third Swell conference, and you decided to do it in Singapore. Why did you decide to do it in Singapore? What's your outlook here in Asia? We're very interested.
Yeah. Well, look, Singapore has been a hub of financial services for, a lot of years, without a doubt. And I think particularly as it relates to blockchain and crypto, there has been, I think, a progressive, forward-leaning viewpoint about how these technologies can benefit existing financial systems, existing payment mechanisms. And so as we looked at various markets, Singapore and MAS as a regulator here locally has been open-minded to, as long as KYC regulations are intact, as long as anti-money laundering regulations are intact and things like that, they, I think, have had a pretty open viewpoint to how these technologies can benefit some of these systems. I mentioned earlier about 40% of our customers are across the Asia Pacific region, and so we felt like it made sense to host an event here. And a lot of the speakers, where our speaker in San Francisco Swell last year was Bill Clinton, and prior to that we had the former head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. Having Dr. Rajan, who used to be the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, obviously he's not from Singapore, but certainly representative of more of this region. And a lot of our speakers on stage with the CEO of DBS yesterday, from this region. And I think reflective of how this region is thinking about these technologies and how payments can dramatically improve.
From a regulatory standpoint, do you find that people in the region, regulators in the region, are more or less conservative than the counterparts in, say, DC, where you just set up an office?
I don't think of them as more or less conservative. I think everybody is sensitive to fundamental financial regulation, like know your customer. I think that one of the things that has held back crypto in general is some of the, arguably kind of, there's a community that I think is so wedded to this, hey, we need to enable anonymous transactions. Governments aren't excited about anonymous transactions. They haven't been for a very long time. And so when, and I have said this publicly before, I think when people are out espousing anonymity for crypto transactions, I don't think that's good for the industry we're trying to grow. We have to be cognizant that we're working within a regulatory framework of the traditional financial system. And kind of taking the approach of down with banks and down with governments, I think is short-sighted in terms of the impact that these technologies can have to touch more and more people and to have more and more people benefit from these technologies through faster transactions, lower cost transactions. There's a lot of ways that helps society.
Absolutely. Brad, as we look to wrap up, thanks again for the time, and it's been very informative and insightful. Just the last few questions that I have for you, and you've spoken about sort of there's been a lot of analog with sort of where we are in relation to, say, Web 1.0, which you were right in the thick of. So when it comes to the, I am too, so it's okay. We're in good company. When it comes to the crypto sort of outlook in the space, there's only a handful of projects that have real utility. Ripple being one of them. Where do you think we are? I think Mark Andreessen was asked this, and he recently on a podcast, and he said 1993, 1994. What would you say? And obviously things move faster now because of technology and this sort of thing.
I would directionally agree with that. What year is always a little bit hard to measure. I using a different analogy. I've said it. I do view this as a marathon. We're on kind of mile 2 out of 26. So I think we got there's a lot of road ahead of us. And I view that as a good thing. I think blockchain technologies are going to touch lots of industries. Ripple has decided to focus on cross-border transactions, cross-border payments today. We will pursue other verticals for sure. But I think that, that it's going to take a decade or two to see that all play out. And quite frankly, if you use Mark Andreessen's characterization, so that was, he says we're 26 years into the internet. Could you have predicted in even 1999 that you could, open your Grab app here in Singapore and have a car pick you up? And I couldn't have even fathomed that. And I was involved in the internet in the very early days of the internet. Right. I think the same thing's true in blockchain. Right. There's a lot of things where I think blockchain is going to touch how transactions happen. It's very hard to predict all the different ways that it will touch consumers and businesses, but it is a profound sea change and I think people maybe don't fully appreciate that yet.
Last 2 questions. Seen a lot of talent accrue from both Wall Street and other parts of industry into blockchain. If a young entrepreneur wanted to go out and join a crypto project, what advice could you give them?
2 pieces of advice. One, try to avoid the hype, focus on the reality. Like, I think a lot of projects are very, spread themselves very thinly, as opposed to really going deep in a specific, here's the customer, here's how we're helping that customer. And I think what has served Ripple well is we've been very focused on a specific customer, a specific use case, and that has given us the ability to go deep there and a lot of momentum. The second thing, I do give this advice. Just last week I was talking to a very talented guy as a marketer who has 0 experience in tech and 0 experience with blockchain. And we have a job posting for a VP of marketing. He was interested, and I said, look, you're probably not going to get the VP of marketing job, but if you're really interested in this space, don't get caught up in the title.
Right.
Like, I think people sometimes get too focused on the title. If Ripple is going to be one of the major winners in the blockchain area, you want to be on a winning team. Sure. And we have now over 400 employees. If you joined 2 years ago, you were one of the first 160 employees. Right. And as we grow, that gives more opportunity for you to grow with the organization, whether that's promotions or more responsibility, what have you. And so I think if you believe blockchain is going to be profound in lots of ways, you just want to be on a winning team. What your role is less important.
Awesome. Last question is an easy one. Where can people find you, follow you, learn a little bit more about the good work that Ripple is doing around the world?
Well, obviously Ripple.com, and I tweet with some regularity at Garlinghouse.
Yeah.
And
apologies for the influx. You're probably going to get swarmed now.
We welcome it.
Thanks so much for your time. It's been really great sitting down with you, and we're rooting for you. Looking forward to hearing all the good things that you guys are doing around the world. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Wow, everyone, that was an excellent interview. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Whatever you liked about the interview, whatever you found interesting, please leave a comment below. Like and subscribe. All right, everyone. This is the XRP Agent wishing each and every one of you well. Take care.